Harbledon Hall had stood empty for 7 years, its walls and windows covered in ivy and brickwork stained with damp and decay. Birds had built their nests in every roof gable, and an army of rats and mice held revels in the empty rooms and passages. One radiant day in June, an older gentleman and his wife drove by in an open carriage and saw the old forsaken house wearing its least sombre aspect in the hot sun. Mr. Stackpoole, a cheerful, energetic man of 60, told the coachman to draw up at its iron gates, remarking on the picturesque nature of the house. A notice painted on a weather-stained board there named the church sexton, a Mr. Judd, as the person to apply to for permission to view the premises. As they drove to the church tower, visible amongst the surrounding trees, Stackpoole chatted about how much he would enjoy setting to work on the house and grounds, transforming its chaos into one of the prettiest places in the neighbourhood. His wife made a faint reply in mind of the fact that Harbledon Hall was the 6th old country house her husband had taken a fancy to in the last 10 years, lavished work and attention on, and, just as quickly, fallen out of love with. Since he had retired, the house refurbishments had become a diversion, although she had been unenthusiastic about the pursuit. Their last move had been from Cornwall, after he became astonished at the amount of rain that fell there. Their daughter Ella had tired of the constant moving, but was now married and settled into her own home, while their son was stationed with his regiment in Malta. Mr. Judd was soon showing the Stackpooles around the place and being questioned about the previous tenants. Sir Rowland Shaw and his family had had a 21-year lease, but had left suddenly with still over 5 years to run. When questioned further, he attributed their dramatic dash to ghosts. Mrs. Stackpoole was sensing a kind of chill, even a kind of depressed, foreboding feeling that she had never had in any of her husband's other houses. He laughed off her qualms and promised her a sunny upstairs morning room in the house and modern electricity throughout that would dispel any lurking presences. He was already planning to place his own study below her room. Later at the agent's, he was further confirmed in his blasé attitude when told that Sir Rowland's children had deliberately frightened the servants in order to escape the slow country living. They had used a magic lantern to illuminate pictures of a skeleton on a sheet, frightening the family back to the bustle of London. After Mr. Stackpoole related the humorous incident to his wife that evening, she was now willing for him to take Harbledon Hall. He calculated that, after all his work, the family would be in there by Christmas, when their daughter, Mrs. Beaumont, and her husband George would be staying with them. Just before their move to Harbledon Hall, Mr. and Mrs. Stackpoole were dining out one night when he met another guest who was Sir Rowland Shaw's brother. The man actually warned him against occupying Harbledon Hall, refuting the story about the magic lantern performance as the reason Sir Rowland was compelled to leave the property. But he refused to disclose any further, as he did not want to prejudice Mr. Stackpoole against his new home. Another odd coincidence occurred whereby Mrs. Stackpoole had written to their son in Malta, telling him of the old house. In reply, Jack wrote that he had met a civilian in Malta for his health, who was Sir Rowland's nephew. He had described Sir Rowland as not in the least nervous, but the phenomena in the house were more than he could stand, and he had to leave. Jack promised to tackle the bogies when he returned home. His letter gave Mrs. Stackpoole an eerie and creepy sensation, and her husband decided not to tell her of his conversation with Mr. Shaw. After some months, the family were delighted as they drove to their new home after nightfall, electric lights blazing from every window and sending out shafts of light into the surrounding darkness. Mrs. Stackpoole, her daughter and son-in-law all chorused that it would be impossible for anyone to be nervous or afraid of ghosts in a house lit like this. By the end of January, the family was winding up their New Year festivities with a fancy ball, still with young guests staying and a number coming from a distance, curious about the reputed haunted house. Costumes they wore were from any era or country, and the spirited dancing continued until the small hours. By 3:15, with a romantic waltz playing, guests who came from afar started to depart, just as a maid brought a message to Mrs. Beaumont that her young son was crying and couldn't sleep until he saw her. She slipped away from fair-willing visitors, encountering her father as he entered his study, where he sank into a low chair by the fire and instantly fell asleep. In the meantime, Mr. Beaumont had wandered outside to smoke a cigarette, where he involuntarily raised his eyes to Mrs. Stackpoole's morning-room window and stood frozen on the spot. The silhouettes of two figures, an old man and a young man, were visible on the blind, the shadows struggling together. From the shape of their heads, George Beaumont could see that they wore tie wigs, and there were clear shadows of ruffled sleeves and cravats from the early Georgian period. He wondered if they were guests in costumes, but none were up there, then watched in terrified interest the course of the brief conflict. The elder and shorter man seized the younger by the throat, who in turn shook himself free, stepped quickly back, and drew his sword, which he plunged through his opponent. He stood for a minute looking downward, and George observed the finely cut features of a total stranger. Then he saw that the man wiped the blade of his sword, turned and walked away, leaving the window blind a blank, luminous square. At the same time, Mr. Stackpoole had been woken by the sounds in his wife's sitting room overhead. A noise of chairs pushed back and toppled on the polished floor, and a scuffling of feet like two men struggling together. Then a moment of silence, a loud stamp and heavy fall that seemed to shake the ceiling, followed by deep groans. Mr. Stackpoole rushed upstairs towards his wife's room, calling out just as his daughter was quickly descending with a pale and terrified face. She had seen someone going into her mother's room, but had been too frightened to follow him. Mr. Stackpoole flung the door wide open and rushed into the room. No one was there, not a chair or table displaced, and the electric light illuminating every corner of the room so as to bar the possibility of anyone hiding. Wiping the perspiration of terror from his brow, Stackpoole searched the room, fairly stupefied with amazement. His daughter explained that a tall young man had run past her carrying a long thin sword. She had thought him a costumed guest, as he wore a blue coat with ruffles at the wrist, a lacy cravat, and a wig tied with a ribbon at the back. She remembered that the only guest in a similar outfit had worn a black coat and had already left early. Then she saw his face, that of a stranger, looking cruel and enraged. Immediately, George Beaumont burst into the room, pale and breathless and trembling like a leaf. He demanded to know who the two fighting men had been and why they had not been stopped before the murder was done. "The old man will never stir again," he declared, as he lifted the tablecloth and looked under the table. He described what he had witnessed from outside the window. Then Mr. Stackpoole reported what he had heard, and his daughter confirmed the mysterious figure who had passed her on the stairs. Harbledon Hall was indeed haunted. People were right about it, they all agreed, and that they all needed to leave the dreadful place at first light. Eventually, all the guests had departed, except for a young man who commented on Mr. Beaumont's drained appearance. He asked in a low voice if his father-in-law had known that Harbledon Hall was haunted when he took it. Mr. Stackpoole heard the question and replied that he was not one to listen to vulgar chatter and was perfectly delighted with the house. The man said that he had lived in the county all of his life and knew by heart the story behind the haunting of Harbledon Hall. However, since Mr. Stackpoole had done it up in a cheerful modern style with electric lighting, perhaps the whole place was changed. Of course, Mr. Stackpoole insisted on hearing the story. Some 150 years ago, a father and son lived there who hated one another. The older man had grossly insulted the woman his son was about to marry and who had refused his own proposal. The two men had a deadly quarrel about it in the house, ending in the enraged son running his father through the heart with his sword. One night, 8 years ago, Sir Rowland Shaw had looked up at the first floor window and seen in clear outline shadows on the blind enacting the tragedy. Other family members had met the shadow of an evil-looking assailant carrying a naked rapier, or been awoken by the sounds of a violent fight ending in groans of dying from the first-floor room. The once sceptical Stackpoole was now convinced that the family needed to leave Harbledon Hall, while cautioning all present that his wife was to never know the real reason. The good-natured lady laughed at her family's haggard appearance at the breakfast table, but agreed on their inconvenient and hurried departure. Mr. Stackpoole preferred that she attribute it to his restlessness and caprice, rather than that her nerves be shaken by hearing the truth. She was accustomed to his impulsive moves, but still curious when he said that he had decided to give up Harbledon Hall and look for a country retreat in the east. She did, however, wonder aloud if her husband had seen the ghost that frightened Sir Rowland Shaw out of the house 8 years ago.